Hi everyone, my name's Ranald Lawrence and I'm a lecturer at Liverpool School of Architecture. The title of my talk today reads as a statement of fact, but I think it is, in fact, an idea with deep intellectual and psychological roots that underpins many, if not all of the ways that we view cities today. My interest in this idea grew out of the history of environmental design broadly, building systems and the impact on how we design and use buildings today. Increasingly, I think we rely on technology to control our environment, building management systems that regulate temperatures and light to meet codified standards and narrow comfort ranges. In the 20th century, the role of technology at the building scale allowed us to conceptually divorce the inside of a building from the outside for the first time, so that we now live in a mostly homogeneous world, when environmental psychology tells us that people are actually happiest when there is environmental diversity and they have the freedom to choose where they are and how they feel. So just as thinking about systems changed how we design internal environments and defined how we approach the question of how we control them, as I often remind my students, buildings don't use energy, people do, I wanted to try and apply some of the same questions to cities. How do we think of cities today? Why do we think we can control them and change them? The first image on the left here is Lieutenant Henry Drury Harness's map for the Irish Railway Commissioners from 1837. It shows the arrival of the information age, thinking about cities in terms of flows of people and goods, and using that to inform planning, where to build the railways. And then we have Geddes' Valley section. Geddes was a botanist turned sociologist who coined the term geotechnics, by which he understood cities as organisms that have a life symbiotic with the surrounding countryside, and the idea that the city needs to be understood as a physical, biological, and social system, an idea that would inspire the botanist Jan Smoot's book, Holism and Evolution, written after his first spell as Prime Minister of South Africa. And the history of spatial planning in Johannesburg and Cape Town shows you how quickly an apparently benign philosophy about nature can be used to justify the very worst examples of segregation that there are. Geddes was the major influence in Lewis Mumford, here on the cover of Time magazine, and his book The Culture of Cities, published in 1938. In The City, a film made for the New York World's Fair, Mumford advocated a transition from an industrial age to a more sustainable way of life, in new towns to be constructed as part of Roosevelt's New Deal recovery from the Great Depression. Mumford foresaw the car as a dangerous disruptor to the future of cities. He thought that freedom of movement would lead to a necessity to keep on moving, or the tyranny of the car. In the 20th century, the car came to symbolize the flow of the city and the freedom it offered. Godfrey Reggio's 1982 film, Koyaanisqatsi, or Life Out of Balance, explored how technology had allowed cities to grow apart from nature, and building on Jay Forrester's concept of the ecosystem, questions what would happen if the balance of humans and nature was disrupted. This idea of the city as an ecological system governed by flows of people, food, goods, cars, and now information continues to be influential. And the top right here is a real-time data model of London, where the physical city is overlaid with digital information about traffic, the tapping of Oyster cards as people go in and out of the tube, big data, and increasingly this data has become virtual with the connectivity offered by networks. The smart city has arrived. But how can this information be used to plan the future? Well, in New York, Robert Moses thought that if you could improve the flow of cars, everything else would follow. The more efficiently cars could move, the less time would be wasted in traffic jams, the more efficient the economy would be, the more free time people would have. This was a gross simplification of what Jane Jacobs called the organized complexity of cities. She said, there is no logic that can be superimposed on the city. People make it, and it is to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans. A decade or so later, in my home city of Manchester, George Chadwick was developing his own theory of town and regional planning, and the idea that what was required was a more joined-up vision, not only cars and transit, but a more informed view including land economics and demographics, what he called the science of cities. In practice, this meant top-down planning by technocrats who would try to rationalize what they found, freeze it in plan form, and then sell it to the people in a series of visions of a better future to which they could all passively aspire. This was underpinned by an optimism about what technology will make possible, and I think you can still see that today when we talk about things like driverless cars and hyperloops. A technological determinism which drove the development of mainstream architectural culture for the greatest part of the 20th century. Paul Rudolph's 1967 project for Robert Moses's LOMEX, or the Lower Manhattan Expressway, proposed to integrate transport infrastructure with linear communities connected at higher level by monorails and other people movers. At a bigger scale, Kenzo Tange's plan to expand Tokyo into its bay also relied on a central spine of services, infrastructure, and government facilities, with floating communities connected to the spine by monorail, a form of urban megastructure built on a metaphor of metabolism reaching for kilometers across the tabula rasa of the sea. This fetishization of layers of transport was responsible for some of the worst failures in social housing from the 60s and 70s. Here you can see Hyde Park and Park Hill estates in Sheffield, forming their own urban landscape, irrespective of the conditions on the ground. Regenerated Park Hill in Sheffield has done away with the open public horizontal circulation, the streets in the sky you can see here with the milk float going along, and replaced it with vertical cores on buzzer access, offering the privacy and security demanded by the upwardly mobile middle class, who appreciate the aesthetic edginess, without the social diversity. But the legacy of the imagery and the conflation of increased mobility with economic progress remains with us. Top right is a visualization of HS2 arriving in Manchester in 2040. And the justification is essentially the same as Robert Moses's. It will cut journey time to London to just over an hour and double the economic output of Greater Manchester to £132 billion by 2050, delivering 96,000 jobs and 16,800 homes. And we know that social engineering without the economic infrastructure, the jobs and services, may offer a veneer of order, but is bound to fail if it cannot accommodate the diversity and complexity of human life. The failure of Pruitt-Igoe and the brutalist urban utopias of that period led to a deep questioning of the socio-environmental determinism that underpinned architects' and planners' intentions. In its place, the work of Archigram proposed a radical autonomy, the freedom of the individual to shape their own life within structures that could evolve and grow without apparent hierarchy. This vision depended on far more sophisticated infrastructural and environmental systems than had been possible in the past. With plug-in apartments and services and schools, hospitals and parks in the sky, all fed by a structural and environmental exoskeleton, literally and metaphorically freeing people from the constraints of the ground. A social technological autonomy. Plug-in City built on the legacy of technological progress that had shaped the modernist project in the early 20th century. Mies van der Rohe's project for a skyscraper on Friedrichstrasse was a dream in 1921. The technology didn't exist then for anyone to dream of building something like this. It was a daft idea, an all-glass building. It would be freezing in winter and boiling in summer. And how would you ventilate it? It would take a few decades for the dream to be realized. Bottom center we have Le Corbusier and Nehmeyer's UN building, an all-glass tower facing east-west, with all of the associated environmental problems, but achievable because of advances in building services technology, air conditioning systems disguised in suspended ceilings, feeding the edges of the glazing in the floor, quite a tricky business to integrate the ducts with the concrete slab, and the invention of fluorescent light tubes, first installed in buildings in 1938. Architects then began designing autonomous system buildings where the structure and the environmental systems went hand in hand. The ideal was a self-sufficiency, so that the architecture could exist independently of its context, made possible by the promise of limitless energy from atomic power. Bottom right is Louis Kahn examining his model for a city tower in Philadelphia. Reyner Banham took this idea one step further. He said, when you have all this stuff and all the bits and pieces that are required to support it, why do you need a building at all? In a home is not a house, he wrote, when your house contains such a complex of piping, flues, ducts, wires, lights, inlets, outlets, ovens, sinks, refuse disposers, hi-fi reverberators, antennae, conduits, freezers, heaters, when it contains so many services that the hardware could stand up by itself without any assistance from the house, why have a house at all? Banham's idea was for some kind of inflatable pods that we could generate an entirely artificial atmosphere inside to meet our requirements, rather like Le Corbusier's idea of a house as a machine for living in. 20 degrees, please, at all times and in all seasons. And you can see here a close-up of Banham's central gadget. Everything you need: television, stereo system, electric cooker, refrigeration unit, AM, FM, TV receiver aerial, landscape flood lamps, and what he calls an air blast for environmental control and to keep the thing inflated, all powered by a solar power collector. Banham was writing at the time of the Apollo space program and all of the optimism that entailed. The last Apollo rocket was converted into a space station, Skylab, and people genuinely believed it would only be a matter of time before we were on the way to Mars. Anything was possible, and there were endless supplies of energy to make anything possible. Banham looked at the space program and basically said, now we could live like that on Earth. Of course, this was all a bit tongue-in-cheek, though Banham's serious enough to reference Buckminster Fuller's project for Manhattan, a dome to enclose the city and provide an artificially controlled or mediated environment, born out of the paranoia of the nuclear age and mutually assured destruction. And on the right is House Rucker Company's 1971 Palm Tree Island project in New York, offering a glimpse of paradise in the middle of the noise and fumes of the city, not unlike something you might find now in Singapore. Bottom right is Oscar Newman's nuke-proof Manhattan from 1969, and here's proper defensible space, a new underground city created through underground detonation of nuclear warheads to protect its residents from more nuclear warheads from above. At the same time, it is possible to create the subterranean layers of the city in a new orderly way, with a honeycomb ground structure 9 or 10 levels deep. In many ways, the early sustainability movement grew out of nuclear paranoia. We weren't too worried about global warming, but the fallout from a nuclear exchange would create the same problem, an uninhabitable outside world. So how could we sustain ourselves artificially? Here we have Biosphere 2, a radical closed-loop environmental experiment run between 1991 and 93, and you can see the 8 guinea pigs before they begin their confinement in their red uniforms on the right. The airtight enclosure spread across 13,000 square meters, attempting to replicate a variety of different natural biomes, including a rainforest, ocean, wetland, grassland, desert, and human systems. The experiment was a failure, of course. Countless things went wrong. The soil was wrong for the crops, the oxygen was depleted too quickly, the UV treatment on the glass killed all the bees needed for pollination. The 8 bionauts themselves attempted to create a new non-hierarchical society, but the strongest characters ended up bullying the others, and they still started smuggling in Mars bars and other food to supplement their diet. After the bees died, cockroaches and ants broke in from outside and started to wipe out all the plants. And at the bottom here we have one of the very earliest designs for a zero-carbon house, the autarkic house project developed by Alex Pike at the Martin Centre in Cambridge in the 70s. The idea of the passive house is nothing new, though at least this one opens up to nature. But we still cling on to the dream of the closed-loop system, the perfect balance of nature, even if only in energy terms. Here is Masdar, the new so-called carbon-neutral city in Abu Dhabi, a modern interpretation of vernacular Arabic architecture in between spaces that allow you to adapt between inside and outside and the use of perforated screens like mashriba to allow air into the apartments, with solar shading on the roofs. Without vehicles, at least above ground, it's a bit like an airport. Everything moves around underneath the plinth, which is like a big multi-story car park. And there's an enormous field of solar panels to keep the whole thing going, the air conditioning inside the offices stretching as far as the eye can see on the horizon. So it's an illusion, really. There is still no such thing as the closed-loop urban system. It seems we haven't really progressed much further than where our story started. Geddes and Mumford realised that the city and the hinterland are codependent. We can take that one step further and say that humanity and nature are codependent. We can't separate ourselves from nature, and we must accept that we will always leave a footprint. The question is whether that should constrain us. Is the only way to prevent climate change to limit the human footprint, or can we look to technology not yet invented to free us from the feedback loops that threaten our survival? Insofar as systems are useful, they tell us superficially how things work and how they are connected together, but it is a mistake to think that they can ever balance or stabilize themselves. The self-organizing system is a machine fantasy of nature, but if climate change tells us anything, it is that nature is full of unforeseen consequences and unpredictable changes. And our urban history is full of examples of seismic events that disrupt the status quo and remind us that it is impossible to predict, yet alone plan, for all events in an uncertain future. Systems thinking offers us the promise of structure and order in an increasingly uncertain world. If only we can find a bit more data to process, then we will arrive at the nirvana of the self-organizing network, where we don't need to make any of the difficult decisions anymore. So we can keep following Alice down the rabbit hole in search of ever more data. But actually, if we are truly to understand how cities work, perhaps we need to recognize that the city is more than the sum of its infrastructural parts. It's a reflection of our societies, ourselves, and our messy politics, and all of the injustices that surround us. And we must look beyond the systems and data if we are to make the difficult decisions necessary to solve all of the problems that we face. Thank you for listening.